Hello once again. In this video, I am going to cover chapter 24, where we are going to look at diseases that involve the digestive system. So when we think about the digestive system, we have to think about the entire system. So from the mouth all the way to the anus. So we're going to start in the mouth and then just work our way on down into the intestines. So the first disease that we look at here is dental caries, or what we commonly call cavities. So you know that the mouth is full of bacteria. We have hundreds or thousands of different species of bacteria that live in our mouths. But typically what happens with cavities is that a biofilm develops. A biofilm is when you get members of different bacterial species that all kind of live together in a little community, and they secrete this glycocalyx, this really sticky, sugary substance that starts to form over the tooth. So as this continues to grow, and if you are not brushing your teeth or you're not going to the dentist regularly, then this is going to continue to erode the enamel on the tooth, and the acids that are produced by these bacteria are going to start to go deeper into the enamel. If it's left untreated, so you don't go to the dentist and you don't get it treated, then it can completely damage the entire tooth. It can progress down into the gums, causing gingivitis, or worst case scenario, those bacteria get into the bloodstream where they love to attack the heart. So you can prevent a lot of cavities just with good dental hygiene, but if a cavity does develop, you need to go to the dentist and get that fixed. So here is a picture of a tooth where you can see the middle portion of the tooth here. The enamel has been destroyed and there is a lesion there. So what would have to happen here is the dentist would go in, they would drill out the affected areas and then fill that with some type of filling, either a silver filling or a white filling. They're all about the same. Now, if this progresses, it can lead to periodontal disease, or if the gums get involved. And again, the treatment is the same, and prevention, just making sure you maintain good oral hygiene. So if the periodontal disease continues, then you're susceptible to a condition that's known as trench mouth. Trench mouth basically is when the gums start to erode. There may be lesions or ulcers or open sores. And because of the decay that's occurring in the mouth, the person's going to suffer from halitosis or bad breath. Now, once you progress to trench mouth, you need to go to the dentist. You'll have to have a good cleaning, and then you'll need to be on antibiotics to prevent these from spreading. So when you look at this person's mouth here, you see these white ulcers, you see the bleeding, you see how the gums have eroded. So this is referred to as trench mouth. This is a very severe case of a progression of periodontal disease. So herpetic gingivostomatitis. This is caused by HSV1, the same virus that we looked at when we talked about cold sores or fever blisters. And what happens here is that instead of the ulcers or the sores being on the external surface, the sores are on the mucous membranes actually inside the mouth. So here is an example of this. This person probably has a yeast infection going on too, based on the surface of the tongue here, but you can see these different lesions that are forming on the back of the throat. Typically only see this really in immunocompromised individuals. Same thing with thrush. Thrush is something that occurs in immunocompromised individuals, and not not necessarily those that have, HIV or some underlying condition, but also those who have been on broad spectrum antibiotic. And it's caused by the same bacterium that causes vaginal yeast infections that we looked at in the last chapter. So this would be a pretty advanced case of thrush. You see the patching in the mouth. This is going to itch. It's going to be really red and swollen. And the only way to get rid of it is through an antifungal medication, usually nystatin. Nystatin is a rinse and swallow kind of medicine. It's a thicker liquid. The individual would take a big swig of it, swish it all around in their mouth so that it touches all of these affected areas, and then swallow it. And this would continue until the thrush was gone. Okay, so now kind of looking at the salivary glands here. So a lot of times people think about mumps, they don't really think about it affecting the GI tract because it is spread by respiratory droplets. However, the virus, the rubeolar virus that causes mumps, affects the salivary glands, typically the parotid salivary gland, so it can lead to peritonitis. In some patients, it spreads beyond this. It can spread to the meninges of the brain. It can spread to the ear, it can spread to the pancreas, or it can spread to the testes and cause orchitis. It can lead to sterility. Humans are the only host for this virus, so this is one of those, like I've talked about with several others, that we should be able to get rid of. There's a very effective vaccine, but we see epidemics every now and again because of the low vaccination rate, which hovers somewhere between 90 and 92%. So here's peritonitis, where you've got a swelling of the parotid gland. So the parotid salivary gland sits right kind of in front and a little bit below the earlobe. So when that gets swelling, it develops what we call this bull neck or bull jaw, where they get a swelling typically only on one side of the face. Now in 2006, we had a huge outbreak in the United States. And again in 2016 and 2017, but we're staying below that. And of course, 2020 numbers won't come out for a while. So, we hovered, you see there in the early 2000s, we were below 500 cases, and then we kind of spike, and now we're kind of hovering somewhere in the 2000s. This is not a good thing. We can get rid of this. We should be able to get rid of mumps since humans are the only host. Okay, now moving down into what we really think of when we think of diseases of the gastrointestinal system, we get to the actual food poisonings or food infections. So just a little bit of terminology here. Food poisoning or food intoxication versus food infection. So food poisoning, it's a term that we throw around a lot, but food poisoning or food intoxication is actually a problem, an illness that results from ingesting the bacterial toxin. You may not actually ingest the bacteria at all. They may be dead and gone, but you are ingesting the toxin that has been produced by the bacterium. In contrast to that, a food infection is when the actual bacterium causes the illness. So you are ingesting the bacterium that is causing the illness. So that's the difference between food poisoning or food intoxication and food infection. So Staphylococcus aureus, which we've already talked about, it's a normal member of the skin or sometimes the mucous membranes, and if the toxin is ingested or the enterotoxins are ingested, then it can lead to a food intoxication situation. Typically where you see staphylococcal food intoxication, are in foods that should be kept cold but aren't. So things like, coleslaw or potato salad or like a seafood salad or shrimp salad, things that have mayonnaise or eggs and should be refrigerated, should be kept cold, and are left to sit at room temperature for too long. The bacteria get in there, they start to divide very quickly and start to produce these toxins. So you ingest the food and then you get sick. This is the most common type of food poisoning. Most of the time it's undiagnosed because it comes on very quickly, sometimes as soon as 30 minutes, but then it's gone very quickly, usually within 24 hours. It's going to cause intense nausea and vomiting, maybe diarrhea or cramps if it makes its way into the small intestines. The thing here is to keep cold foods cold and hot foods hot. Like that's the idea really with all of these types of foodborne infection. If something should be refrigerated, don't keep it out. Don't let it get to room temperature. Make sure that it gets back in the refrigerator. The one thing about staphylococcal food intoxication is refrigerating it or heating it up, reheating it up, does not inactivate the toxin. The toxin is very heat stable. So, if you have some like a coleslaw and it gets warm, just throw it out. Don't attempt to save it. Don't try to put it back in the fridge, or you're setting yourself up to potentially develop food intoxication by Staphylococcus. So one of the really bad dudes in terms of foodborne infection is Shigella, which causes shigellosis. And what you'll notice about a lot of these foodborne infections is that they are gram negatives. They're all pretty closely related to one another in the Enterobacteriaceae family, which we'll do a lab on next week. Shigellosis can be pretty serious for those who may be immunocompromised or who have other health conditions. It produces a toxin called Shiga toxin, which induces diarrhea, and this can last about a week. And the main risk for this is dehydration because of the amounts of diarrhea that will happen. Loperamide or Lomodal or Imodium is not recommended. And really it's not going to be recommended for any of these, because the idea is the more that defecation occurs, the more bacteria are leaving the body. And so less bacteria equals less toxin. So anytime you have these foodborne infections, loperamide or Imodial is not recommended. You want to rid your system. You want to rid the intestines of these pathogens. So you don't want to take an antidiarrheal medication. So here is a stool sample that has red blood cells. So this stool would be bloody. So there's red blood cells and white blood cells. And then you see these negatively gram stained bacilli here. That would be indicative of Shigella. Salmonella enteritidis causes salmonellosis, and typically we think of this being associated with eggs or poultry, but there are a lot of different ways that someone can contract this bacterium. The good thing about this bacterium is the infectious dose you see there is 1 million or more. So you have to come into contact with and ingest a large number of bacteria in order to get sick. Diarrhea, fever, abdominal cramps for 4 to 7 days. So going to be miserable for about a week, usually self-limiting. Again, the risk here is dehydration. So you see there ORT or IVT. So ORT is oral rehydration therapy, and IVT is IV fluid therapy. So the key thing here is just trying not to get dehydrated. You see some estimates from the CDC a lot of times when we hear about foodborne outbreaks, they do involve salmonella. There was an outbreak in 2013 traced back to turtles. The largest foodborne outbreak in the entire United States happened in 2008, almost 1,500 cases of this, and they never even found out exactly what had caused the outbreak. Another infection caused by Salmonella species, Salmonella typhi, is typhoid fever. Now, fortunately, in the United States, we don't really see a lot of cases of typhoid fever. Typically, people in the United States who present with typhoid fever have traveled overseas to areas where this may be more endemic. It invades the lining of the small intestines, and then it spreads to the liver and gallbladder. So it's going to be shed in bile. Some people are carriers. They may never actually get sick, but they can still shed the pathogen in their feces. Fluoroquinolones, ceftriaxone, or azithromycin easily treat this. So it's really not something that we have to worry about as much anymore as we used to. Now, E. coli is one that gets a bad rap when it comes to cases of gastroenteritis. We have E. coli that lives in our intestine and is good for us. It helps to outcompete other, pathogenic bacteria. It helps produce vitamin K and some B vitamins for us. So the E. coli that lives in us is good E. coli. The pathogenic form of E. coli is typically going to have a certain arrangement of antigens. So in my last lecture, I talked about, in the lecture before last, I talked about flu. And I talked about how flu viruses had those H antigens and N antigens associated with them. Well, E. coli has something similar. It has O antigens and H antigens. And we classify the types of E. coli by what type of antigens it has. And typically with E. coli, we're looking at O157H7 as the bad strain, the one that is really typically associated with E. coli infections. Most E. coli can be self-limiting, but again, due to the amount of diarrhea, may require some type of rehydration therapy. Sometimes, especially in those who are young or old or have some type of underlying health condition, it can develop into something called HUS, or hemolytic uremic syndrome. And this is when the kidneys get involved. And this can be fatal if the person does not receive treatment. Something that we don't really have to worry about in the United States, but that is a huge problem worldwide, is cholera. This is a disease that's been around forever, and it spreads through contaminated water. Typically, what happens is a person who is infected will defecate into a watering spot that is used by other people for drinking water. So this is primarily something that we see in developing countries where they don't have good sanitation. It can also be transmitted through food, particularly raw shellfish, including oysters. If the water is contaminated, oysters can filter that out. They're filter feeders. So basically what that means is they take in a lot of water and they let the water out, but keep all of those things that are kind of floating in the water, like algae or bacteria. So if the water is contaminated with this pathogen, then the oysters or other shellfish can also be contaminated. Abrupt watery diarrhea, vomiting, leg cramps. Basically with cholera, we really have to be concerned with dehydration because of the sheer amount of diarrhea that will occur. This can lead to hypovolemic shock. Basically, the blood volume goes too low, and then it can start, causing problems with the heart. You see there the mortality is 70% in untreated cases. The number one thing that we can do for cholera is rehydration therapy. The problem is that in a lot of these countries, it's their water that's making them sick. So they know they need to drink water. They go back to their watering hole, and they're basically just reinfecting themselves over and over again. Cholera is killed by boiling. So if they can boil the water and then mix it with an electrolyte solution, then this will help them help maintain their potassium and sodium levels until the diarrhea goes away. The most commonly reported cause of foodborne illness in the United States is campylobacteriosis. You think, wait a minute, you said a while ago that it was Staph aureus. Well, remember, most cases of Staph aureus aren't reported. So we believe that is the most common, but in terms of being reported, it's campylobacteriosis. Contaminated food, and this again can be in a lot of different foods. The bacterium does not produce a toxin. It is the bacterium itself, so it is a food infection. It may last a week to 2 weeks, but it does typically go away on its own in normal, healthy individuals. So one that it really hasn't been that long ago that we discovered actually was due to bacteria are peptic or gastric stomach ulcers. 90% of all stomach ulcers are caused by a bacterium called Helicobacter pylori. It's very closely related to the Campylobacter that we just talked about. And in fact, it used to be called Campylobacter pylori. Then we realized, it deserves its own genus. So it attaches to the mucosa in the stomach and produces a particular enzyme called urease to neutralize stomach acid. The stomach is very inhospitable. Most organisms can't survive in the stomach. Helicobacter pylori can, because it can produce this enzyme that helps it neutralize the stomach acid, so it's not affected by the hydrochloric acid. There really isn't any way to prevent the transmission of this. Some people have it and never develop ulcers. Some people contract it and develop an ulcer. The treatment is really dependent upon the doctor and what they want to prescribe, but typically is going to involve 2 antibiotics to try to prevent resistance, plus some type of proton pump inhibitor or acid reducer, like a Prilosec or Protonix, something along those lines. So Clostridium, we have 4 different species of Clostridium that all wreak havoc. And the first one here that we're going to talk about in this chapter is Clostridium perfringens. And it produces a lot of different toxins. So this is a food intoxication. It is one of the more common foodborne illnesses. However, good news, it's self-limiting in less than 24 hours. So it's very similar to Staphylococcus aureus in that respect, that it comes on quick and it goes away quick. However, the main difference here with Clostridium perfringens is no nausea and vomiting. Instead, cramps and diarrhea. So it's not going to cause nausea and vomiting at all. So if you get sick very quickly after eating and you start throwing up, that is probably Staphylococcus aureus. If you don't have any nausea and vomiting, but you have cramping and diarrhea, potentially could be Clostridium perfringens. Our other Clostridiums, or another Clostridium species, is Clostridium difficile, which we commonly refer to as C. diff. and can lead to a condition known as pseudomembranous colitis. Basically, what happens is the bacterium gets down into the colon, which is the large intestine, and starts producing toxins and a particular enzyme called hyaluronidase. Hyaluronidase is this enzyme that breaks down hyaluronic acid. And hyaluronic acid is essentially the glue that holds our cells together. By producing hyaluronidase, the bacterium can dissolve that glue and get down in between our cells, which allows it then to invade the intestinal wall. And this leads to hemorrhage and can eventually lead to necrosis or death of the tissue wall. If that occurs, then an intestinal perforation can occur. And now all of these bacteria can spread into the abdominal cavity, which is almost always fatal. A lot of times we see this in patients who are on long-term broad-spectrum antibiotic therapy. Those antibiotics kill off the normal flora. They can't outcompete the C. diff anymore, and they begin to basically divide out of control. So not taking broad-spectrum antibiotics or stopping broad-spectrum antibiotics is best. And then treating with either vancomycin or metronidazole, depending on what it's susceptible to. Probiotics, yogurt, sometimes successful depending on how far along the infection is. But kind of a new thing that is being tested and used are fecal transplants. Yes, that is exactly what it sounds like. This is when fecal matter from someone who lives in the household is transplanted into the intestine of the individual who is suffering from a C. diff infection. When you live in a household with someone, especially for a long period of time, your normal flora is typically very similar. You're eating a lot of the same foods, you're being exposed to the same things within your house, so your flora are very similar. So by taking feces from someone else in the household and then transplanting that into the colon, what that's going to do is put all of those normal flora back in there so that they can start to grow and divide and outcompete the C. diff and kill it off, essentially.